The other point is that our criminal justice system wastes a lot of money by trying to censor content that doesn't cause harm to anyone. This year, a publisher of sexual stories was sentenced to 40 years in prison because some of the stories and illustrations on his website involved fictional minors. And this is in a context where we have a backlog of real child sexual abuse cases that aren't being prosecuted because we don't have enough money and we don't have enough resources, and we're going to imprison someone for publishing stories. It's really just a misallocation of resources. And that's one of the reasons why we oppose censorship. Censorship doesn't deal with the problem. It sweeps it under the carpet. And it does divert our attention away from real cases of abuse, which is what we should be concentrating on.
Now, what is your views and goals in terms of the people, say, that you're working for as well, besides the children, right? Because there's stigma against them as well. Sex workers, for example, Kinksters, how do they fit into the equation of trying to protect children's rights? How do they help?
Well, partly it's about, because we're both a child protection organisation and a human rights organisation, when the human rights of others are infringed on the basis of, on the pretext of child protection, then our role is to defend them. But the other thing is that they also have a lot of expertise in their own communities that is important in protecting children from abuse within those communities. So let me give you, or protecting adults within those communities as well. So let me give you a concrete example of that. So the American Law Institute this year, it's an institution of lawyers. They released a new version of their model penal code on sexual offences, which is designed to update the law on topics like consent, sex trafficking, and the sex offence registry. And they actually did listen to stigmatised groups because they wanted to make the law better. And so one of the groups they spoke to was the National Coalition for Sexual Freedom, or NCSF, which represents the consensual kink and BDSM community. And Prostasia Foundation is an affiliate member of the NCSF. They've been doing magnificent work on defining and educating people around consent for years. And so by including them and drawing on this work, the American Law Institute was able to make recommendations for reforms to the law on consent that work for a community that lives and breathes consent culture in everything it does. The same applies to sex workers. If you want to stop minors from entering sex work, the police aren't going to be the solution. Nobody in the sex industry will ever go to the police for help if they can avoid it, because this ends up in them being arrested at best, and at worst, they may even be sexually assaulted by the police. So instead, if you want to help minors who are performing sex work, which is obviously a bad idea, the first people that they're likely to turn to for help are going to be other sex workers, because people in the sex industry don't want to see minors doing this work and being abused and having their content put up online. Of course they don't. And for years, in fact, sex workers have been campaigning for stronger consent and safety standards for their industry. But do policymakers turn to them for advice in combating abuse in their industry? No, they turn to morals campaigners and credit card companies. So one of the reasons why we platform these groups is because they actually have, some lived experience that is useful in protecting against abuse in their sector. And if we're not listening to them, then we're missing out on that experience and that wisdom.
Right. So that is your second strategy. You are trying to bring about the voices within these more marginalized and very vulnerable groups of people, say sex workers, LGBTQ folks, Kinksters, who have a lot of stigma on them. And they can offer us, as you say, a lot of wisdom about how to be able to create better protective laws for children.
Yeah, if we only listen to law enforcement, we only get carceral solutions. But carceral solutions are ineffective at dealing with the complexity of this problem. If we want to make progress, we have to also bring in non-carceral approaches such as education, mental health support, and social services. And that means listening to people from outside of law enforcement and also those who are harmed by the criminal justice system. And so while we acknowledge that there is a role, and an important role for the criminal justice system in dealing with this problem. It's only a small part of the total picture.
Sure. Now, one could say, well, most people probably don't want to become sex workers, and to be able to put this type of work out there, because you do have a podcast, right, in line with Prostasia, that is allowing advocates for your work, sex workers included, to host talks about how do I prepare myself for sex work? How do I take care of myself? And some of the statements, are pretty provocative, saying like, I make sure that I get really, really high, the night before and so forth. Like certain things I think is a little bit more facetious, but when you have those types of conversations, I think people will take and cherry pick those statements and make it seem blown up, where, like weed is legal nowadays, so that's not a problem. But what is the general appeal, to like more family-oriented individuals when they come across organizations like Prostasia? Obviously, there is a deterrence, perhaps, because you're talking about sexual topics, mature sex work topics, and I think that is a breach that needs to be gapped. How do you be able to convey to individuals, we care about your children, we really, really do care, and having these people come alongside of us, they can offer that wisdom, but it does have a difficulty in terms of PR, I think.
Oh, yeah, definitely. Yeah. And I mean, the interview that you're referring to, that you're alluding to, is not our best example of trying to sell our approach. That there was an icebreaker question at the start that my colleague made to the person we were interviewing, and that's the road they went down, and we kept that in the interview because that's just how the conversation went. Same as our conversation, sometimes it'll go in a direction that we don't expect. So we have about 30 episodes of our podcast series, and yes, you're right. I mean, people will definitely cherry pick the most controversial or the most odd seeming examples. Same with our Twitter account. We had a very controversial tweet that we did a few years ago, and that's the one that everyone comes back to. They're never going to.
Taiwan? Is it?
Sorry?
Is it the cartoon?
Yeah.
Okay.
So what we were trying to get across with that tweet was that we need to focus on if there is real child sexual abuse material out there, we should be reporting that rather than reporting cartoons. If there's a cartoon that you don't like, just block it, and then you'll never see it again. So let's focus on that. Let's focus on real child abuse reporting rather than cartoons. But do we always get our messaging right in PR terms? No. Like, we're mostly a volunteer team. And we're learning as we go along, because nobody has had an organization like this before. So the community that we're building is definitely unique. And we don't always agree with each other on the way that we approach this. But we are growing stronger and more effective. This year, we have a record budget that we've been putting towards prevention research. And we've had more members of our team joining than ever before. So even though our progress may seem to be challenging at times, we're learning and improving as we go. And I think that in the future, Prostasia Foundation is going to be a little better at navigating how we deliver our message in a way that doesn't result in members of our team being attacked and having to, in some cases, fear for their safety.
Right. Now, that's a point that you also brought up as the third strategy about censorship that you kind of alluded to with the hentai, the cartoon pornography, right? And so there's some distinction issues between like what's considered porn, a cartoon, and what is harmful, what's not harmful. What do you think, as someone who has studied law, especially in this area, this is your expertise, right?
Yeah.
Where does censorship go wrong? And why is Prostasia getting hurt by this? Because obviously, like, there is a general fear that there's going to be child pornography out there. How are you pro censorship in certain ways, and how are you not?
Yeah, well, we are against child sexual abuse and the dissemination of images of child sexual abuse, of real children being abused, either in photos or videos. that is a form of abuse. It's image-based abuse. And so really that's where we believe censorship resources should be focused, because there's no valid place for that content online. Just like there's no valid place for abusive imagery involving adults, revenge porn and so on is also not welcome anywhere online, and rightly so. However, censorship with a broad brush can affect those who are innocent. It can affect LGBTQ communities, sex educators, basically anyone who talks about sex online. You may have noticed yourself that if you talk about sex on YouTube or on TikTok, your content's likely to be demonetized or removed, or you'll have to self-censor. There's a lot of people who, use this strange new vocabulary when they're trying to talk about sex online just to avoid censorship. How is that healthy? The other point is that our criminal justice system wastes a lot of money by trying to censor content that doesn't cause harm to anyone. This year, a publisher of sexual stories was sentenced to 40 years in prison because some of the stories and illustrations on his website involved fictional minors. And this is in a context where we have a backlog of real child sexual abuse cases that aren't being prosecuted because we don't have enough money and we don't have enough resources, and we're going to imprison someone for publishing stories. It's really just a misallocation of resources. And that's one of the reasons why we oppose censorship. Censorship doesn't deal with the problem. It sweeps it under the carpet. And it does divert our attention away from real cases of abuse, which is what we should be concentrating on. So that's not to say that, triggering content should be freely accessible to everyone online, especially, pornography shouldn't be accessible to children online. We've never said that. But what we promote is tagging content, warning users for content, and basically making sure that nobody is exposed to sexual content without their consent. So really providing more information rather than censoring is the way to go. Making sure that if there's a story out there that involves a minor in a sexual situation, it definitely shouldn't be something you come across accidentally. You should be warned about it, and you should have the chance to keep it off your to keep it out of view.
Right. Okay. So I could definitely see that you're not like a Xi Jinping Maoist type of Big Brother approach, to censorship. You shouldn't say just like censor it all. Anything with the slightest hint of what comes off as sexual behavior in children should be deemed as unworthy of the internet. But then you also want to be a little bit more specific about, well, what happened if I have questions, about sex? What happened if I have questions about what someone did to me? Was that inappropriate, right? And if you don't have those resources, that could be a potential argument for having certain types of more incremental or specific regulations toward divvying up what is accessible, what's appropriate to have online, and to have those warnings. So I read that on your website, one of your articles was talking about that, having those warnings when you look at Google, because, I imagine, what would I get if I searched child pornography? I'm not interested or would not want anyone, myself, to look up something like that. But what do we ask of ourselves? What happened if there was a FBI case, and would the FBI actually get in contact with us if they saw us looking at this article, right, about child abuse or whatever it is? Yeah, so I think drawing that line can be sometimes hard on the internet, but I think generally, again, goes back to this general stigma about abusing children. And we're going to have a heck of a time. You're going to have a heck of a time trying to convey to people about how we should try to balance that in a way that's going to be very cohesive to general understandings and education about sex education, abuse as well, but without getting into the nasty type of exploitive stuff that may creep in, right?